What do the poets E. E. Cummings and T.S. Eliot, cultural critic H. L. Mencken, composer John Alden Carpenter, novelist P. G. Wodehouse, beatnik Jack Kerouac, media mogul William Randolph Hearst, painter Paul Nash, and President of the United States Woodrow Wilson have in common? They were all rabid fans of a strange, surreal newspaper strip about a black cat who is in love with a mouse, and a mouse who is constantly throwing bricks at the cat's head. Why did George Herriman's Krazy Kat so enchant these readers, even as it alienated much of the public? What did these illustrious figures see? Today on Truth, Beauty, Comics.
Welcome to Truth, Beauty, Comics. I'm Levi, a cartoonist.
And I'm Felix, a guy who likes comics.
This is the podcast where we look for transcendence in a pulpy medium. And today we're going to be talking about the first 3 years of Krazy Kat Sunday strips by George Herriman. And really quickly, before we dive in, I got to give a little plug for Felix, if you don't know, is a journalist who does a lot of writing. And if you like comics, you should really read his latest article on Alley Oop. I had to plug that because it's fantastic. It's fun. And what is that series you're writing called, Felix?
The Ninth Art.
The Ninth Art. Yeah.
If you Google Felix Miller, The Ninth Art, they'll all pop up.
Yeah, you're one of the few people who are contemporary people who are actually writing about all the comics I love, and definitely give that a read if you get a chance. You can find all these online, but anyway, yeah. So with
Thanks.
that out of the way, yeah, no, it's good stuff. With that out of the way, Krazy Kat, Felix, when was the first time you ever encountered Krazy Kat?
Encountered or heard about?
Or heard about, yeah, in some form or another.
Because I heard about it a lot as a kid, because people like Bill Watterson or what's his first name, McDonald, the one who does Mutts, and a bunch of other cartoonists that I really enjoyed as a kid cited George Herriman's Krazy Kat as kind of their Rosetta Stone, and I didn't really see that much in common between a lot of these comics, except that I really liked them. And so I, heard it referenced at various times, but this was sort of early enough days in the internet that you couldn't really get sort of a lot of Krazy Kat easily. And the couple times that I sort of Googled and found one, I was a teenager, and it's sort of these massive sheet strips that you have to zoom way in on, and usually they're pretty low quality copies anyway, and it was hard to read the handwriting, and it's confusing what's going on, and so I never really read it before the last year, as I've been sort of returning more seriously to a lot of these historical comics that have been really important, and so this is so crazy in a sense. I don't have a kind of native love of it in the way that some people do. I more have this sense that this really matters. It's sort of like
Right.
When I was a teenager, I knew opera was good and mattered and was worth caring about, but I didn't get in my bones until I got a bit older. And then sort of one day I went to an opera and it just clicked, and I was just completely in.
Right.
And so that sort of click is only really starting to happen. There are certain strips that just pull me right in, and there are other ones that still feel like a little confusing and a little bit of a chore. So I'm kind of still being acclimatized. So I've been aware of Krazy Kat for a long time, but this year is really the first time that I'm reading it more extensively and really enjoying it. But it takes more work than most other strips. What about you?
Yeah. I think in a similar way, I actually think I encountered, according to my memory, which is, a little bit hard to rely on for this one, but a book that I just loved and adored as a kid was the Smithsonian Collection of Newspaper Comics, which I think should be a part of anyone who likes comics library. And it has it's a huge book. It's a large print book. You can find it pretty much in any public library. And it has 6 Sunday strips of color Krazy Kat. And I remember being fascinated by the art. Like, the art was really kind of arresting to me, but nothing necessarily beyond that. Right. And then I kind of became aware of I think almost totally through Calvin and Hobbes, because I was a huge Calvin and Hobbes fan, and Bill
Ditto.
Watterson would just sing the praises of Krazy Kat. So so that was kind of the two forces that slowly made me aware of it. And so I would just kind of I think as a young adult, I would start like just trying to find collections of it and explore it more. So it's been something that I've been reading for a long time, probably since my early 20s, maybe even in my teens. But yeah, it wasn't something that was like in any newspaper that I ever read, or it was kind of like you had to go searching for it to find it.
Well, I mean, it's sort of still that way, right? Like, it's not,
Yeah.
even though it's really influential because it's, I mean, for those who haven't read it before, um, Krazy Kat is old enough that each Krazy Kat Sunday strip was a whole side of a newspaper, right? So it's,
Right.
something like 30 some odd inches tall, and therefore really hard to reprint for anything approaching affordable. Because you either end up making it so small that that it's basically impossible to read, and it's hard enough to read anyway because it's sort of Harriman has very squiggly handwriting, and it's sort of
Yeah.
a little uneven. Or it's so big that it's hard for it not to be expensive. I really
And
like.
maybe that's a.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say maybe that's a good point to just say, for this episode, George Herriman is a really interesting historical figure as a cartoonist, I think, and there's his biography is kind of fascinating. But we're not going to talk a lot about his biography on this episode. We're going to save that for the next episode. So
Yeah, I think it's really easy when doing research on Harriman and Krazy Kat. There have been some revelations in recent decades that have led to the writing of. So I'm maybe a third of the way through it, but possibly the most interesting comics biography I've ever read. Krazy, George Herriman, A Life in Black and White. But the thing is that it's easy, I think, to start talking about biographical stuff with Harriman and then just spend the whole time sort of reading that into the strips, rather than encountering the strips as people did for decades. And so the only things we'll really mention this episode, and next episode we'll sort of bring the biography in a bit more, are that Harriman was born in 1880 and became a newspaper artist around his 20s, I think. And he published Krazy Kat from 1913 until around his death in 1944. His work was never very popular, but as indicated in the cold open, just a lot of intellectuals and movers and shakers were just entranced by his work. And William Randolph Hearst believed that his comics were so important that he gave Harriman a lifetime contract, which was effectively unheard of in comics at the time and now, to ensure that Harriman would continue pursuing his art. So we'll just kind of have that in the background and know that next episode there will be a bit more digging into Harriman, but it's just, like I said, it's sometimes easy to talk so much about his biography that we don't actually look at his work. So I want us to kind of focus on the early work, the first few years of the Sunday strip, this episode, and the next episode we'll get a bit more into everything else.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's just kind of the question after reading this, preparing for this episode, reading Krazy Kat work for most of my life. I wonder, what do we make of this comic strip? What to make of it, because it is. I have the same experience with someone like, say, George MacDonald, right? Who's a writer, a number of works. And C.S. Lewis will talk about George MacDonald like it's like a vision of heaven when he encounters his writing and stuff. So as someone who loves C.S. Lewis, who loves his writing, I would excitedly approach George MacDonald and leave like, I think I've tried to read fantasies probably 10 times. I have it. I own it. I've started it so many times, and I cannot make heads or tails of that book. And for Lewis, it was like a revelation when he read it. So I'm like,
yeah,
it's one of those things where you go, what's wrong with me? Like, why am I not
Mhm.
getting this? Like, it makes you question your own judgment, right? And and I think that's kind of the conundrum of Krazy Kat, right? Is it's beloved by people who, I mean, like, you could not find a more beloved cartoonist in my heart than Bill Watterson, right? So if all this praise was not there, I ask myself, like, would I give Krazy Kat a second look, or just be kind of like, oh, that's a weird one, I don't get it, And I
Yeah.
think that's the experience of so many people when approaching this one. But then it stayed in the consciousness because it was so meaningful to people that have much more widespread, following than Bill Herriman did, George Herriman.
And I do think
Um,
there are times when you can
yeah,
see that Harriman is stretching the comics format in a number
yeah,
of ways. I mean, I feel like especially in the early weeks and months of Krazy Kat. So by the time he started the Sunday strip, he'd been doing daily strips of Krazy Kat for I think 3 years. So he had,
mm,
and even before that, he'd done tons of strips, uh, all fairly short, a week, 5 weeks, 10 weeks. When he starts on Krazy Kat, we do have the sort of main trio of characters, Crazy with a K,
mm-hmm,
Nat's Mouse, and then Pup, who will later become Officer Pup. Uh, all of them are fairly, they come fully, sort of somewhat, basically fully formed.
right,
Crazy is kind of a sentimentalist, and she's a sweetheart who is in love with Ignat's mouse, whom he's always calling Angel, which is spelled,
mm-hmm.
Aingel or something, or
Yeah,
J, I forget. Anyway,
yeah, it's a J.
yeah, Jay. And she talks in a kind of almost a kind of half black, half literary speak,
Yeah,
right? Sometimes it's uh you know southern slang, sometimes it's allusions to Shakespeare or even to Roman poets. um Harriman himself was quite a good linguist. I think he
yeah,
knew
clearly,
something like four languages fluently and had bits and pieces of others. Um, and then Ignatz is just sort of a jerk from the
yeah,
beginning, wanting to throw bricks at Crazy's head. But we have these moments where it seems like Ignatz, like he has a bit more depth to him. Um,
right,
and Pup is, the dog of the trio, and he eventually becomes the sort of symbol of law and order, becomes Officer Pup. But from the beginning, he's sort of a sweet dog who is kind of rough on Ignatz and is in love, or at least really likes at this point, Crazy. Um,
yeah,
and there are various other little bits and pieces that come together, the catfish or whatever. Uh,
mm-hmm.
but early on, he's just experimenting so much. Some of the strips are extremely talky. Some of them have virtually no dialogue. Some of them
Yeah,
are, playing with kind of political stuff that's going on in the day. Some of them are just silly stuff with balloons, and I think from the beginning there's a kind of sense of I don't know, there's a sense of melancholy, I
hmm.
think, to Crazy Cat. Um Even as it's very silly and jokey, it is about unrequited love in a very meaningful way. But as I said, he's sort of stretching the comics format, and so I can see
Yeah,
if you're reading this in the 1920s, say, um, that you're sort of saying, oh, like this has never been done before. Um,
yeah,
and oftentimes with things like that, when you go back to them, you think, okay, well, this is sure it's stretching it, but is there really anything here now? But I do think there's something here now,
yeah.
but I can't articulate what it is.
Yeah, it's. I think there's some reasons when I look at Krazy Kat. I was like, okay, so why was this so inaccessible for most people? And I think some of the answers are really obvious. Like, this is a literally hard to read comic, like, and it doesn't change. Like,
Yeah.
and it's part of the charm. But it's all his lettering is very difficult to parse out sometimes, So he writes the comic in his own, hand. He doesn't use a letterer, which a lot of cartoonists would do at that stage. And he has pretty rough handwriting. So it's difficult to read. And then when you actually, can parse out the letters, it's this really affected dialect, heavy use of phonetic spelling, I dialect, and then mixes in like different languages a lot of the time.
Yeah,
Like
well, and different
Spanish.
dialects too, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
Crazy doesn't speak like Ignatz, even though neither of them speak like you or I do.
Right. Yeah. So just parsing out the meaning of stuff can be really challenging sometimes, and just, um, so that's one aspect I think about it. And then there's the other part that I think there's not jokes or punchlines. I mean, I think Krazy Kat is a funny comic strip. But it's not in the same way that normal comics are funny, where there's a setup and then the last panel like lands the joke or something like that. And this is more common, I feel like, when you get to the 60s and where comics becomes much more of a machine, less of an artistic kind of creation. But the humor is strange in Krazy Kat to me. It's like so simple. Someone gets hit in the head with a brick, that it's like infantile, but then it's like so like buried at the same time and so elevated. So it's weird humor. Or it's very it takes work to get to the humor.
And the art is this way too. Less so at the beginning, but as the strip goes on, Herriman will start experimenting not just sort of with the size and shape of panels and how they interrelate, but also backgrounds. And so as he goes on, Krazy Kat sort of becomes famous for the background of each panel in a strip being completely different. And this is part of what some of the surrealists really liked about it. And this is, I think, especially striking in the color strips, which are the ones where the art really sort of pops for me. Because the first few decades, Krazy Kat was just in black and white, and then it started being colored, and it's not colored like anything else is colored that I've seen. And you really notice, like Krazy was in front of a short building, it looked like in the first panel, and then suddenly there's a skyscraper and then there's a mountain, or whatever. And he's sort of experimenting with these backgrounds that are largely inspired by sort of Arizona, which he loved, and I think like took regular vacations to. And that's right, like that's just sort of off-putting, or especially if you aren't, it's sort of like if you're in a literature class in high school and someone gives you preparation for Shakespeare and says like, okay, these are what some of these jokes mean, and get used to visage means face and whatever, and you get a little bit of a sense of what you're walking into. And I think there's something similar with Krazy Kat, that it's a lot more approachable when someone's kind of told you, okay, like here's what you're getting, here's what to expect. If I were just turning from the sports page to this, I'd be sort of weirded out as somebody sitting in 1920 or now.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the he's not following a lot of the So even comics at this time, right? And I think a lot of the comics we've examined on this show, like if you take Tintin, right? So Tintin, the continuity and the verisimilitude, to use a big word, of the settings that he puts his characters into is part of the thrill, right? So you feel like a real sense of place and location. You feel like you have your bearings and you're like going on an adventure with kind of with grounded characters, And so Krazy Kat is like the exact opposite, right? Where it totally throws out continuity. It's like a fever dream a lot of the time. And so it's so it's hard. And I think that's why I think my appreciation for Krazy Kat has grown quite a bit over the years, but it still isn't like a desert island comic. Like if I had 10 comics to bring with me somewhere,
Yeah.
I don't think Krazy Kat would make that list because it doesn't have the drama or like romance or thrills that like I feel like, other comics can bring, but I think there is stuff to love about it.
Yeah, and I mean
and yeah,
even right like uh Ignat is married, but that rarely comes up. You know what I mean? Or like
right, yeah,
Lucy is usually a girl, but sometimes has masculine pronouns. Like there's just sort of weird stuff. But there's just you're kind of never on a really firm footing with Krazy Kat in
right,
a way that you are with something like Tintin that you know, okay, at the beginning of the adventure, something will happen and Tintin will be tossed into a crazy story and will eventually save the day by the
yeah,
end. You know, right? It's. I mean, even though they're all really great, you know, there is a certain formula, and also with newspaper strips, even at this time, it was, you know, it would be setup, middle, punchline. Setup, middle, punchline,
hmm
setup, middle, punchline. And, you know, Sunday strips were, I think, still kind of finding their way at this time. But even so, that was basically what it was attempting. Whereas when I'm
yep,
reading Crazy Cat, it's pretty rare for me to laugh.
yeah,
I might find it funny, but it's not something that I'm necessarily laughing at, and it's not it's rarely I'm rarely laughing at the end of a strip when I am laughing. It's more like
right,
something, you know, right? Like
yeah,
when Crazy gets hit in the head with a brick, I don't really laugh at it.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
you know, and I mean, it's striking again. Like Harriman is constantly experimenting, right? Because a lot of the strips, there's a kind of, and some of my favorites, there's a kind of expectation waiting for the brick to drop, so to speak. You're waiting for
yeah,
Ignatz to throw the brick, and the brick doesn't get thrown. Um,
hmm
but from the it's something, it reminds me. Have you ever come across the webcomic Dinosaur Comics?
No, I haven't.
So it's been going on for 15, 20 years now. Every single strip has the exact same art. It's like 5 or 6 panels of these two dinosaurs talking to each other, and it has the
Okay,
same size speech bubbles in the same place, but with completely different words.
hmm.
And so
So it's pretty
you
much
can't.
Garfield at this point, right?
But it's sort of like, you know, and
Yeah,
sometimes it's sort of a silly joke about dinosaurs, and sometimes it's kind of talking like free will, and sometimes it's about math, and some right. It's sort of
right,
it's very experimental. Crazy Cat is not this way, obviously, right? Because it's just so wildly artistically experimental for really its whole run. Um, but for whatever reason, when I read Crazy Cat, I often like dinosaur comics often comes to my mind.
hmm.
Um, you know, and I think part of it is just this like the the nature of the premise of Crazy Cat is cat in love with a mouse, mouse throws bricks at the head of cat. Like that's it.
Yeah, yep,
But somehow he gets decades of weird, surreal, exciting, kind of heartbreaking at times stuff happening from it.
yeah. And I think what I always thought of with Crazy Cat is as the example of someone who does this is, and you have young kids too, so they might be getting to the age of watching this, but Phineas and Ferb, um, which is it's a it's a kids cartoon with the exact same plot every single time, like the exact same things happen in Phineas and Ferb with just some of the circumstances changing, but it's pretty much the exact same story every single time, and it's hilarious. Our kids love it. We love it. It's like one of our favorite shows. So I think it's actually really an interesting framework for telling a story over years, is just to do the same thing over and over again and then find the delight in the variations on the single theme or the single plot, the plot points that you set up. Yeah, I think that is really interesting. And yeah, it gets down to, so it's one of those things like, and I'd be curious to hear, like, what do you love about Crazy Cat? Because I think there's things I do love about this. Like, even though I've said, it's not my favorite comic, I think, what it most reminds me of, I guess I got to say is, one of my favorite poems is Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll.
Mhm.
And maybe that's a helpful even genre to be thinking about with Krazy Kat. But
Yeah.
and it's not like it's a funny poem, but it's a surreal, weird, nonsense poem that somehow makes sense.
And
And
it's
most of the
playful.
yeah, and exactly. And most of the pleasure comes in like just reading it, especially aloud, and you're just like, oh, this is really fun. But when you try to like dissect it, it starts to fall apart in a weird sort of way. And it reminds me of that. And Lewis Carroll, in even just a larger sense, kind of reminds me a little bit of, kind of Alice in Wonderland, at least. Um, a
Yeah,
lot of the
and I wouldn't
stuff
be
in Crazy
surprised if there's
Cat
an influence there
could very
of
well be.
Carol
Yeah.
to Harriman. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think I read it and I really like Crazy,
Hmm.
like as a quote unquote person. Right, because there's this in the midst of confusion and difficulty and I mean violence, right? He has this kind heart.
Hmm.
And I mean, obviously, if I knew someone who was in love with a married man who was regularly throwing bricks at her head, um,
Right.
I wouldn't be encouraging that relationship for very obvious reasons. Um, but there are various comics when, for instance, a child is in need of help, and Ignatz is usually sort of uncaring and just sort of out to get what he wants, which is usually to throw a brick at Crazy's head. Um,
Hmm.
but Crazy makes a point of trying to assist them and usually succeeding. And he also, or she also, Crazy is a sort of character without guile.
Yeah.
Um, she consistently thinks the best of others, even as Ignatz is constantly sort of throwing bricks at her head. Um, and, obviously there are kind of limits to that, right? Like, you do need
Mhm.
to be aware if someone wishes you ill, but Crazy is kind of constantly put in these situations and yet maintains a sort of kindness. And that doesn't mean that she's not sort of silly and that she doesn't try at various times to play pranks or whatever. Um, but there is, I think, underneath this sort of kind heart um, that is not something I really expected when I started reading it. Um,
Yeah.
and just this kind of yeah, that like that I find I don't know sort of I mean and it's hard, right, like to know how much Harriman is holding Crazy up as an example of like virtue or as an example of kind of pathetic failure,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
and so there is a kind of tension there, right? So I don't want to just look at Crazy and say, oh, I read this and Crazy is my moral exemplar, but there's just
Yeah.
something sort of touching about that.
Yeah, that's interesting because for me, that's I think the major barrier for me connecting with this comic, um, is because I've never been able to even like comprehend what the internal life of the characters are beyond the events of what happens. It's so inscrutable to me. Like, why is this happening? And it feels if they behave in such strange ways, even though they behave the same way every single comic, that it's never clear to me. To me, what I love about Krazy Kat that I think first off is the art. Like this has always been the major appeal to me about it is
Absolutely, yeah.
it's just sketchy, it's expressive, it's like improvisational, and it's so creative. Like it's just every time like everything he does is like so full of imagination, and that's where I just find sometimes and even as a kid I'd look at these pages and I wouldn't even read the words, but just the images that he would put out there are really like um so weird and memorable. There's nothing quite like it. It is like to me like it's kind of like a vivid dream. You look at the stuff and it's constantly changing, and every panel just looks different. So from the perspective of the art, I think I've always loved Crazy. I had an appreciation for it on the artistic side, but I think as more as I've given the time to actually sitting down and trying to read through it, and parsing out the language and the words, um, Harriman's writing is just really impressive. I think his use of language, like there's these pages are just like full of like such funny and like Baroque prose, it's just so the writing is, and that's where the humor comes for me. All the humor in Krazy Kat comes for me is the stupid, I mean, stupid, but like the simplistically like base plot of someone getting hit on the head with a brick coupled with this like really Baroque elevated prose is like so funny sometimes to me. And that's where I'm like, and that's something that was lost to me as a kid, I think, that I've more come to appreciate. But
Yeah,
it's an impressive feat, no matter how you look at it, just to put this stuff out every week. I'm just like, I couldn't imagine doing it.
there's this one image that's from a Krazy Kat strip that's used in the Herriman biography right towards the beginning, um, where I forget the exact word, but basically Crazy sees an ink pot and is saying to Ignatz, from such as this are we created, sort of, like musing
Yeah.
on the fact that they are but images of ink on a paper. Um, it just sort of gets me because, of course, like Ignatz just wants to throw a brick at his head. Um,
Right. Yeah.
there is this kind of there's a lot of humor that comes from the kind of incongruity, and I think that grows as the strip goes on, because there are
Yeah.
moments of this in the early years, but especially as you get into the sort of 30s and 40s, 20s, 30s, 40s, you get a lot more of Harriman kind of bringing his learning to the page. Sorry, I just
Yeah.
realized my laptop is about to die. I need to plug it in. I'll be right back.
Yeah. No problem.
Sorry about that. So it's more of him sort of bringing his learning to the page.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me, I guess this feels like, and I'm not just saying this because of, Herman's, kind of ethnic heritage, but it really feels like jazz to me. Like, I can appreciate jazz and even really enjoy jazz music on a number of levels. The skill it takes to do, the improvisation. At the same time, I find it exhausting sometimes. Like where
Yeah.
it's like a little bit goes a long way, and it's for me like even as my appreciation for Krazy Kat has grown, it's a lot easier to appreciate as a work of art than like connect with and enjoy emotionally. And so and I think that's why I've never had it as one of my favorite comics, because it doesn't allow me to enter in. I always find myself just like going like, wow, that was really impressive, or wow, that's really clever, as opposed to just kind of being sucked into it completely.
Yeah, I think the comparison to jazz is really useful because, I mean, well, there's sort of two ways that jazz is used. Bad jazz being played quietly in the background of an elevator,
Right.
or basically like watching real jazz happening,
Mm-hmm.
And and as someone, I'm a singer, but I'm not really an instrumentalist, and so uh, I don't I don't understand jazz on a deep level, right? In a similar way
Mm-hmm.
that I'm not really an artist, but I am a lover of comics. When I am watching jazz being performed, being made, um, there's something sort of astonishing about it, right? But
Right.
it kind of demands more of me than a lot of other music.
Mm-hmm.
Even music that I like or dislike. Um, and I think Krazy Kat, like I found it sort of difficult to sit down and read a chunk of Krazy Kat.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would really enjoy reading one or two or three, and then as I was getting to even the fourth and fifth, it was sort of like, okay, it's washing over me. It's sort of like I'm not, and I mean, right, like there is a reason. I mean, there are lots of reasons, but sort of artistically, it actually really fits being a weekly installment. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there are things where I find the idea of having to wait to read them as they came out infuriating, right? The idea of having Tintin a few pages at a time just sounds
Yeah.
miserable. Or I love reading the classic Hal Foster Prince Valiant in these gorgeous books by Fantagraphics, where I just sit down and I'm reading weeks and weeks of basically painting level art with an Arthurian legend. Whereas Krazy Kat, like, that's the amount I want on a Sunday. I want to
Right.
like read through
Yeah.
one and I can sort of sit with it. But it's funny that struggle with the kind of emotional side because if I'm in the right mood for it, I find the kind of quiet melancholy that permeates many of the strips really attractive.
Mm.
And this might be a good time to start. We've each picked out a few strips to sort of highlight. And, I was just thinking so the first one I picked out, which was April 30th, 1916. It was the second Krazy Kat strip. And if you want to see it, go to the show notes on Patreon that you can see for free. There'll be link in the description. So it's a little hard to describe it. Krazy is holding a balloon, and Ignatz runs up behind her and steals the balloon. And there's no words. Ignatz sees, or sorry, Krazy sees Ignatz flying away in the balloon because he's obviously much smaller than she is, and so he's sort of flying off, and Krazy runs up this huge tree and tries to jump and catch him, and then runs up a giraffe to try and catch him, and then finally is picked up by a bird and is able to catch him and and then once they're both on the balloon, they fall down to earth, and Ignatz, there's sort of question mark, they fall down to earth, and Krazy sort of wakes up, and it's ambiguous whether they've just landed there or if he was dreaming, or if she was dreaming rather. Goes over and kisses Ignat's mouth and says, "Little darling, I'm so glad it was only a dream." Gives him a little kiss, gives him a little kiss on the cheek, and then is dreaming again of Ignatz as an angel. And Ignatz says, "I dreamed an angel kissed me," and they both go back to sleep on the log. And there's so this strip stuck out at me for a number of reasons. One, because this is really early in the Sunday strip, so he's really figuring out what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it's unlike the vast majority that I've seen, at least, of Krazy Kat strips. It's almost entirely silent,
Yeah.
and relying on visual storytelling. It's also clearer than most of them, right? You see it and you know exactly what's happening, and that's not always true.
Yeah. And it does have some of the, yeah. So when I look at this strip, which I'm glad you picked this one because this is a good one. It is sweet. It's also really, there's something about, and this is what again, the thing I always find myself drawn to with him is the art, because the image of Ignatz being carried by that broom, I just find really funny. There's something about it like that makes me laugh. And that's where I think that, I'm not really sure what the punchline is here, but it's funny. And so it is sweet. And I mean, do you think part of the melancholy that you detect in this is due to his use of blacks and kind of the way he constructs his landscapes?
I think sometimes yes and sometimes no, because sometimes you have these kind of melancholy stories, right, about like the coconuts or whatever.
Yeah.
On an almost, I don't know the word for it, a sort of fantastical background that's kind of almost exciting, or fairy tale.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess fairy tales have their own kind of melancholy usually.
Yeah.
And it's striking because it is kind of a funny strip, right? Like just seeing,
Yeah.
like Herriman doesn't always do action, but there are times when he does, when it's just masterful, and just the way that Ignatz, he's just grabs the balloon and is floating up, like
Yeah.
it's funny to see, but it's also striking, right, that like there are times with Krazy Kat where the end makes you sort of recontextualize the rest of the strip, right? Because me first reading this, not having read a lot of Krazy Kat, I'm thinking, oh, okay, she wants her balloon back, obviously. And then it sort of
Yeah.
becomes clear at the end, no, like she was concerned for Ignatz's safety.
Mm.
Like Krazy was trying to save Ignatz, and then is really glad that it was only a dream.
Right.
And
Right.
also there's that kind of moment, right, where when awake, Ignatz has nothing but disdain and bricks for crazy most of the time.
Right.
Um, but when asleep, he has this dream that an angel kissed him, and it was
Yeah.
crazy giving him a peck on the cheek. Um, there's
Yeah.
just sort of a lot there. And it is, it's like I said, it's something that you kind of have to sit with, right? Like
Yeah.
I can't read. I mean, this is sort of a potentially offensive example, but like I can't read the Bible, even the historical books of the Bible, the way that I read a novel. Because I'm quite comfortable reading 50, 75, 100 pages of a novel that I'm really into, right? Whereas
Mm.
trying to read a large chunk of the Bible, it just kind of washes over me and it stops really going in.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
right, because it's just not like it's not that kind of literature, right? And I think Crazy
Right.
Cat is this way where it's not it resists simple, easy consumption.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. I agree with that. Yeah. And I think that's maybe, maybe that's why, one of the reasons, it's best consumed on a weekly basis. Like I could see, being delighted each Sunday to kind of parse through and kind of sit with the latest Crazy Cat strip, and why it's harder to just devour it in one whole kind of, reading spree. We do literature. It's more rewarding to kind of to sip on it instead of just,
Yeah.
drink it all down. Yeah.
Dante is similar, where if I try to read, like 5 or 6 cantos of the Purgatorio, I just like stop even being
Start
aware
glazing
of what's
over.
really
Yeah.
happening, right? Whereas like if I'm reading one or two, it's really powerful and really striking, and I
Mm.
love it. But it's frustrating because it's very long, and so I want to like go through a lot of it. And I think Crazy Cat is similar, where there are decades and decades of the stuff, and so I want to have read all this Crazy Cat rather than oh no, like the better thing, the more virtuous thing is to enter into the work, um, and let it sort of transform me as it will, or let
Yeah.
me sort of see it. Do we want to look at one that you picked out?
Yeah. Yeah, let's take a, so it's interesting. I think we had a miscommunication starting. So I ended up, I thought we were going to talk about the whole book. You thought we were just going to talk about 1916, but I'm glad because I ended up picking out later comics. I do think it gets better as it goes, which is,
Absolutely,
probably
yeah.
unconsciously.
And I think also it
Uh,
gets more sort of verbally funny, which I appreciate.
yeah. Yeah, for me, definitely. So I ended up, first one I did here is this April 14th, 1918.
Yeah, talk
And
about a melancholy strip.
yeah, this is a weird one. And it's a little bit, it's strange. So this is the, how do I describe this? So Crazy comes up to a grieving the Senora Anita Gata Blanca, the white cat, Anita the white cat, who's mourning in her barrel, and she's saying she had 6 kittens, and but then that very night, her husband was struck down by a flat iron on the back alley fence, and then her 6 kittens were taken from her, and so Crazy thinks, oh, that's so awful. They're both weeping together. Then Crazy goes off and asks this dog, and the dog says he's seen them in a bucket of water, apparently drowned. Um, so Crazy's disturbed by this, and then asks. Then it changes to she goes to see this owl, and the owl tells her that there's that kittens that are drowned in a bucket of water become catfishes. And there's a note that says also kittens that get lost in trees become pussy willows. It says it has nothing to do with the story though. So then Crazy runs off to tell Ignaz. He's excited. She's excited. And she says, I found out. And then Ignaz says, found out what, fool? What makes us cats so darn afraid of water? So that's the end. And
And
Ignaz
Ignaz
is
is about to
gonna
hurl a
throw a
brick.
brick. Yeah, exactly. That's how it ends. So really, really a strange a strip here. And I think this is one of the reasons I picked this out is mostly the writing. Is to me it just his okay. So let me just give a couple examples. So if when Krazy goes to ask the dog, does he know anything about what happened to the kittens? He says, but if yon bucket of water could give tongue, what a tale it could unfold. So and say it's just this very clever writing. And then he goes, from this bucket of aqueous doom, Krazy beholds in his mind's eye the wraiths of many kittens arising from its horror-plating depths. So it's really clever writing. It's really dramatic. But at the same time,
also
it's
you
a
get
weird
this kind of
story.
Almost breaking of the fourth wall, right? Because it starts, it says prologue and a bucket of water.
Yeah.
And you get, her interlude of sorrow, the climax, anguish.
Yeah.
He sort of,
Right.
it's like a modern building sort of showing its bones to you.
Yeah.
He's kind
And
of like,
this is common with even authors at the time where they'll I think of Roy Crane, who's an author who was writing around this time, and he'll do stuff like this where, the heroes are trying to solve something and it's like, oh, heartbreak, she was not there, it'll show them their, so this kind of narration happens, but it's so weird and over the top.
It also sort of reminds me of like a lot of Renaissance era books and book publishing where you'll have like a kind of almost little spark notes on the side of, Raphael Hythloday introduced. Hythloday tells his story. Hythloday meets blah, 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 or whatever on the side, and I think it's sort of, you can find your place. But it is sort of very strange. And I kind of wonder what some of his influences there were. And then it's striking that all the narration and kind of fourth wall breaking ends before the end of the strip, where you have Krazy coming to tell the sort of good news of, the afterlife of kittens. And also, this is one of those things where it really has been a century plus since these strips were published. The idea of drowning kittens in a barrel, right? It just sounds horrific.
Yeah, it does.
And it was just an everyday occurrence then.
Yeah.
And probably just because, cats tend to be spayed now. And actually, weirdly, it's illegal in most states to intentionally not spay your cats. But it's just, I don't know. It's funny. There's sort of realism about death throughout the strip, and there is, even as Krazy is constantly being hit by bricks and not dying from anything, but.
And that's what I liked about this one is the contrast he's making here between this kind of morbid, sad, very Baroque story, and told in, this way where everyone's weeping, and then the ending is so just so silly.
Yeah.
It's just I like that contrast, hits me as funny, and so it's. This was one that it's a good kind of introduction, to me at least, to the flavor of what you're going to get with Krazy Kat. It's like this contrast between, kind of morbid, dark, not morbid, but just kind of dark, melancholy, drama, and then a mouse is just kind of a cad and wants to hit him on the head with the brick.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Another one of mine, September 17th, 1916, is I picked it out in part just because it was possibly the most sort of Looney Tunes-esque comic of the first year. And it was, in a way, kind of the most like a quote-unquote normal Sunday comic strip. The setup is that Ignatz is going to go away and doesn't want to have to see Krazy anymore. And he starts down the path, and Krazy sits there being sad that her angel is going away. And then Ignatz comes around the other side of the path and is really angry that Krazy is following him. And Krazy's sort of confused and sits there. And Ignatz, he goes around again and sees Krazy and is angry again, and then fine officer pup comes and is asking what the problem is, and says, "Oh, she's following me. She, won't let me go." Da da da. And pup says, "Okay, Ignatz, you go to the left, and Krazy, you go to the right." And then, of course, they bump into each other again on the other side because Ignatz has been going in circles. And then they bump into each other again, and Officer Pup sees it and just puts up a big road closed sign, go on, straight ahead, keep moving. I don't know why this one just kind of struck me. Part of it is that it was more accessible than most.
Yeah.
But it was kind of showing that Herriman can do this kind of simple comedy when he wants to. Right? I mean, there's that old sort of saying in art of you need to master the rules in order to break them.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to sort of break them well with perspective or anything, like you need to know what you're doing and be able to do it. This is
Right.
well well done in a. Oh, sorry. This is well done in a Wes Anderson movie, The French Dispatch, where there's this artist in prison who paints these like extremely weird, abstract images. And at one point, they ask him to paint, I think, to draw a bird, and he draws this just little bird, and it's perfect. It's just beautiful. It's sort of museum quality, and they say, like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
he's a genius. Um, and part of this is probably the filmmaker Wes Anderson patting himself on the back a little bit for being able to break the rules, because in that movie he is sort of breaking a lot of
Yeah.
contemporary filmmaking rules. But I think it gets the point across really well that, like, I mean this as a compliment. It feels very Looney Tunes.
Yeah.
Um,
It does.
just
Yeah,
like
you're right.
comedy and timing is really excellent. Um,
And I think,
yeah,
I mean, Harriman was someone who, Krazy Kat is kind of more him at his full flower, but he worked a lot and for quite a while in newspaper comics. It was always a little weird, I would say, like if you read like Baron Bean or The Family
yeah,
Upstairs, but it is much more grounded in what you'd expect from a newspaper comic. There's jokes and it's good. It's actually I really enjoy some of his early stuff. Um, so yeah, he's certainly he knows he can do that sort of stuff if he wants to. Well,
maybe you want to talk about one more of yours.
yeah, let's pick one more. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to August 4th, 1918, and this is an example I think of where let me skip ahead in my
Oh, I love this one.
yeah, this is I think where um, everything's working kind of perfectly. Where I think the art is fantastic, the writing is hilarious, and it's the premise is so yeah. I'll describe it. So it opens with Ignatz. He's saying, "Fortune favors me, a brick." He's come across a brick just laying on a hill, and the narration says, "A brick, the hardest and the most wicked and translucent of its kind, that it should fall into the hands of Ignatz Mouse. Alas, the pity of it." And then Ignatz, the moon rises apparently immediately, so there's, and, and Ignatz says, "Welcome, sweet moon, your chaste light will sure help me in my work this night." And
I
so,
love that.
yeah, I mean, it's just the words are so funny. And so then he sees Krazy sitting on the kind of the brow
Oh
of
wait,
the hill.
you gotta read the bit below where it says, "And
Yeah,
the
you go
moon,
ahead.
the moon, date of the queen of the night, that she should lend aid to this contemplated massacre." I just I don't know. I
Right.
love the juxtaposition of the sort of poetical language with "and the moon, the moon of the night,
Yeah.
the queen of the night." I don't know why, but
Yeah.
that just kills me.
Yeah. So Krazy is sitting on the brow of this hill, and Ignatz is going to sneak up and beat her with the brick. And it says, and Krazy Kat, the victim, oi, oi, oi. And Krazy is saying, "For tonight I am a widow, sadly." But then a cloud comes across the moon, and Ignatz can't see Krazy. So he goes, "Oh, doggone that cloud." Then came the moon and eclipse. So an eclipse happens after this cloud covers the moon, the darkness of which cannot even an owl's eye could pierce. So Ignatz is getting increasingly frustrated. "Dag nabbit," he says. Then, as the moon will do, she go down, just like that. And Ignat says, now it's all off. The night's work has gone to pots. Krazy's
Actually,
still sitting there.
it's even better than how you read it. It's not as the moon will do, it's as moons do.
Oh,
Like
you're
it's just
right.
all these moons that you're encountering.
Yeah,
They're
as moons will
always like
do.
this.
Yeah. So then Ignatz decides, all right, I'm just going to take a nap. I'm not sure why. He wants to do this at night, apparently. But this resourceful mouse and his violent brick quietly slumber and await the day and the sun in whose light the deadly work will go on. Yes. Oh, I see. I misinterpreted this. He's waiting until sunrise. Yes, the sun rose, but with it a fog. Then did the cloud of the nimbus variety enshroud it. So things are just going so wrong for Ignatz. Then, like its sister the moon, it is also laid low in darkness by an eclipse. And Ignatz says, what a world, what a world. And then the sun, like the moon, will go down. And so it does. And Ignatz just is crushed. This is the end, he exclaims there. And the last panel is Krazy in the light of a firefly examining the brick and he says, look, Mr. Firefly, it seems like Ignatz overlooked a pretty nice brick. Heh? And that's the end of that one. So this, it's using the classic premise of Krazy Kat. Ignatz wants to bean Krazy. But, oh man, it's just so funny. I don't know. The art, and I got to call it the art in this one. I love Herriman's use of blacks. He does this stuff where he does this hatching with midtones and just gets such, creates such effective like moods, and they're so fun to look at. And this is a relatively straightforward one, but it's just kind of using all the things I love about Krazy Kat together and to deliver a really funny, little story here. I don't know. What did you think of this one?
Absolutely. Yeah, I loved it. I think so much of it is this, this is a few years in, and this is, I think, when he's really started to master the playing with language, right? I mean, I really just keep coming back to, and the moon, the moon, queen of the night. It like that just gets me, right, and it's this mix of kind of the poetical with Queen of the Night and these sorts of things with kind of traditionally like low class dialect, and it's Y apostrophe KNOW, and again the kind of juxtaposition of Mouse wants to throw a brick at the head of a cat, and it becomes this sort of excuse for poeticizing. And it again has, these two things that I really find striking about Krazy Kat: the sort of melancholy to it, and then also the kind of continual goodwill of Krazy, right? Because it gets to the end, and he's saying, "Look, Mr. Firefly, it seems like Ignatz overlooked a pretty nice brick, huh?" It's right? She's not saying, "Oh, thank God," she didn't, it's almost sort of concerned, like, "Oh, Ignatz, missed this brick."
Yeah.
I don't know. It's almost hard to talk about, right? Because it is so oddly elevated while still being very kind of low, so to speak. And it gets back, I think, to some of the conversation we had about Scott McCloud's understanding comics and kind of the extent to which comics is a lower high art. And I think he is playing with that here as he does many other places. And just the art, the use of blacks throughout here, it's striking to look at the whole image, and at the top you have these two mostly black panels, and then at the bottom you have the sort of two left and right. And it's sort of visually appealing to look at as a whole sheet. It's sort of just impressive. There's a kind of symmetry, and also kind of broken symmetry, that really I think works. And I feel like this is also sort of simultaneously it's kind of inaccessible, but it's also one of the more accessible strips, I think.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good way to, I think the best, if you're interested in reading Krazy Kat, is to just see how you enjoy it. Is kind of thing. Don't go into it expecting kind of a typical comic strip. But you could pick a strip like this, and see if you like it, because I think that's the thing, that it's, again, kind of getting back to the Jabberwocky thing. Like the fun is in the consuming of it, and the reading, and in the reciting of it.
Yeah.
And I think this is a strip that really strikes that for me. Is that everything on this page I really love, and there's not like a single joke that makes you LOL, but it's the whole kind of experience, and the whole presentation of it is really enjoyable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would it's hard to give a kind of blanket recommendation for Krazy Kat. I would basically recommend it to someone who hears what we've said today and has been intrigued. Um,
Right.
right, like it's not, oh, if you're like a really big comic reader, you should read it. And it's not, oh, this is a good comic for new readers. It's sort of like, if this sounds like things that you'd like to play with. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The word play and the art and sort of everything that makes up Krazy Kat. Then it's worth diving into. Um, yeah, and I think
Yeah.
it's also it's hard to kind of talk about the like appropriateness of it. There's occasional use of like racial humor, including at one point that I noticed, the use of a slur for a Chinese person. And there's constant comic violence of bricks being thrown at heads.
Yeah.
And there's references, as we got in today, to death and even suicide. But so it's kind of hard to give a give a guidance on it,
Mm-hmm.
because as I'm reading it, it's not. I don't think to myself this is inappropriate for any particular age, but also it is. I don't think it's something that would really appeal to most children. Um, or even
Yeah.
necessarily most teenagers, even most sort of artistically inclined teenagers, I think, um, might like some of the art. But as we said, it is kind of it's difficult to enter into.
I think for me, where I always found the inspiration for Krazy Kat was just that, and again, it is like listening to a jazz musician. Even if you're not particularly inclined to be a jazz musician yourself, you can appreciate just like the person just like throwing this, like going all out with their instrument, or in this case, just putting it all out there on this page, where it's just like, it takes so much talent, and you're like, wow, like it always, for me as a kid, even, when I wanted to, start drawing comics and stuff, I wanted to have that same ability to just kind of express myself in ways. And that's where I think, the inspiration and the effect that George Herriman has on artists like Bill Watterson is the ability to be like, no, I'm going to write something that's expressive. I'm going to do something that is like kind of from my soul, even if it's, there's no one like, George Herriman, but I'm not going to lock myself into this, convention so much. So I think there is, merit from an inspirational sense, to read. But honestly, I would recommend if you're interested in kind of exploring further this and similar comics like it, get the Smithsonian collection, because that's usually pretty cheap on Amazon. It's easy to find, or you can find it in your library. It has some good Krazy Kat in it, but it also has a lot from this era, and you'll get to see a lot of people just doing amazing stuff. So that's a good introduction if you've never even read stuff from this era. But I also would recommend the comic art, Krazy Kat, the comic art of George Herriman, which is a really good collection. It's one I've had, and it covers most of his career pretty extensively.
If you enjoyed this episode of Truth Beauty Comics, there are 3 things you can do for the podcast to support it. The first is to just keep listening and tell your friends about the podcast.
The second is to review the podcast, giving it 5 stars on whatever you use to listen to podcasts.
The last thing you can do is to consider contributing to our Patreon with a monthly donation. For as little as $3 a month, you can get perks like access to exclusive episodes, voting on topics for upcoming episodes, and even an original drawing from Levi. But most of all, you can help make this podcast sustainable.
And that's the end of the episode. You can reach us at truthbeautycomics@gmail.com or on our social media accounts. Thanks for listening, and remember to take comics seriously and have fun while doing it.